He lost his brothers in war. She lost 10 years of her life in prison for a crime she never committed. They were never meant to meet. Until one winter morning, a service dog suddenly pulled his veteran toward a forgotten gas station at the edge of town. What began as a simple act of kindness slowly turned into a fight. For truth no one wanted uncovered. Why did a stormy night awaken an old phone that hadn't worked in years? Why was a sealed well hidden behind the building? And why did a powerful family want this land back so badly? What they uncovered would change an entire town forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe. Winter had tightened its grip on Millbrook again. Hard frost on roadside grass, a pale sun trapped behind low clouds, and wind that sounded like it carried old names. The streets looked unchanged, but the silence had weight, as if the town had been holding its breath for years. Cole Bennett drove in with both hands locked on the wheel, like it was the only thing keeping him stitched together. 48 years old, tall and lean, from a life that never allowed softness, he wore exhaustion the way other men wore cologne, quietly and everywhere. His chestnut brown hair was threaded with early silver at the temples, kept short out of habit, and his beard stayed trimmed close, the kind a soldier keeps when he's trying to look ordinary without feeling it. A faint scar traced his jawline, pale against weathered skin, and his hazel eyes carried the faraway focus of someone who still scanned rooms before he relaxed in them. The war had ended on paper, but not in his body. His shoulders tightened at sharp sounds. His breathing counted exits. His mind replayed what went wrong, as if repetition could make the past survivable. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, a 5-year-old German shepherd trained for PTSD service. Broad chest, black saddle coat over tawny fur, amber eyes that missed nothing. He was not just a dog to Cole. He was the thin line between control and collapse. Atlas knew the tremor that started in Cole's fingers before panic arrived, the subtle lock of his jaw when memory tried to claw forward. He knew the exact pressure that calmed, shoulder leaned in, paw planted firmly, warm weight that said, "You're here. You're safe. Breathe." The funeral had been 3 days ago. Paperwork waited. Decisions waited. The house waited most of all. Cole had told the military he needed leave. He'd told himself he would sell the house, close the chapter, and keep moving. Movement was what he understood. Movement was how you outran ghosts. Staying still meant they could finally catch up. The house sat at the end of a narrow road, half hidden behind bare maple branches. The mailbox still leaned left. The porch steps sagged but refused to give up entirely. Cole parked and stayed inside the truck longer than necessary. He told himself he was listening for danger. The truth was simpler. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into a room where grief had been patiently rearranging the furniture. Atlas jumped down first, snow crunching beneath his paws. He circled once, nose low, then returned to Cole's door and waited with quiet certainty. Cole followed. The key turned with a stubborn scrape. Cold air greeted him with the smell of dust and old wood. Atlas entered behind him, nails ticking softly across hardwood floors. The living room looked paused mid-sentence. A recliner with a worn armrest, a folded knitted throw, framed photos of a boy and a soldier staring from different timelines. Cole looked away first. He moved through the house, turning on lights out of instinct, forgetting bulbs didn't owe him loyalty. The kitchen sink held a single chipped mug. The hallway coat rack still carried his father's jacket, heavy and silent, holding the shape of a man who was no longer inside it. Cole touched the sleeve with 2 fingers. His chest tightened before he could stop it. Atlas stepped closer and pressed against his leg. Cole exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," he murmured, the same lie he'd told doctors and commanders. Atlas stayed anyway. Upstairs, the bedroom waited with quiet order. The bed was neatly made, the way his father had always insisted it should be. The sight made Cole uneasy. Order felt wrong in a house that had lost its owner. Houses should unravel when people leave them. He sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs sighed beneath him. Outside, a branch tapped the window in steady rhythm. In another life, it might have been peaceful. In this one, it sounded like a signal. Cole lay down without removing his boots, Sleep was not rest, it was ambush. When it came, it arrived like falling, heat, noise, a sense that something was wrong before the world understood it. Then the memories shattered apart before details could form. Cole woke gasping, hands searching for something that wasn't there. Atlas was already moving, paw to thigh, shoulder pressed firm, warm weight grounding him in the present. Cole focused on the dog's steady breathing until his own followed. He moved to the window and stared into the empty yard. His reflection hovered in the glass, a man who had returned home but not returned to himself. Morning arrived slowly. Coffee tasted thin. The house remained silent. Cole opened the folder of documents, property records, realtor number, tasks that would turn a home into paperwork. He told himself it would be easy, but his hands hesitated. Selling the house would remove the last physical link to the boy in the photograph, to the father in the jacket, to the idea that he once belonged somewhere without earning it. Atlas followed him room to room, a quiet promise in motion. Cole sat in the living room, forearms on knees, staring at the blank television as if it might offer instructions for how to be human again. "A few days," he said quietly. "Just a few days." Atlas exhaled, as if agreeing to guard the fragile promise. Outside, the winter sky stayed gray. The house held its stale breath. Cole did not notice when Atlas suddenly lifted his head toward the distant road, ears forward, listening to something the man could not yet hear. Morning came without warmth. The house felt smaller in daylight, as if night had at least offered shadows to hide in. Cole lasted less than 10 minutes before the silence began pressing against his ribs again. He grabbed his coat without finishing his coffee. Atlas rose immediately, falling into step beside him with quiet readiness. Cole didn't choose a direction at first. He just walked until the town thinned and the road curved toward the outskirts. Atlas pacing half a step ahead, like he had somewhere specific in mind. The cold air sharpened every breath and cleared the fog from his thoughts, but it did nothing to quiet the restlessness inside his chest. The farther they walked, the more unfamiliar the road felt. Cole had grown up in Millbrook, yet entire stretches of it now felt like places he had only heard about in passing. The town had moved on while he had been somewhere else, and now he was walking through the gaps in memory. Atlas kept a steady rhythm ahead of him until the road bent around a stand of leafless trees, and the shape of a building slowly revealed itself through branches and pale winter light. A rusted roadside sign leaned forward at an angle, its paint cracked and faded from decades of weather. Copper lantern, fuel, and market. The letters were barely legible beneath peeling layers of red and cream paint, and the lantern logo at the center had almost disappeared entirely. 2 gas pumps stood near the road, like relics from a different lifetime, hoses stiff and split, metal dulled by rust and neglect. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were clouded with grime, thick enough to turn reflections into ghosts. The place looked forgotten in a way that made the quiet feel deliberate. A faint scent rode the cold air, dust disturbed recently, oil, and something warmer underneath. Atlas slowed, nose lifting, then continued forward with steady certainty. Cole stopped a few yards from the entrance and called out before stepping closer. "Hello?" Only the soft scrape of something moving inside answered him. The front door stood open just enough to let a narrow blade of daylight spill across the floor. Cole stepped closer, posture tightening in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with habit. Atlas moved slightly ahead of him, calm but alert. The quiet presence of a partner who had learned how to enter unknown spaces without making them louder. Inside smelled like dust, old wood, and rust. Shelving still lined the floor where a convenience store had once stood, though most of the shelves were empty now. The counter remained intact, coated in a thin gray film of neglect. Near the far wall, a ladder leaned against a section of ceiling where daylight leaked through a small gap. Beneath it stood a woman sweeping debris into a metal dustpan. She turned at the sound of footsteps. Ruth Callahan was 65 years old, tall and thin, with the sturdy posture of someone who had spent most of her life working rather than resting. Her hair was cut short and practical, silver threading through what had once been dark brown, and she wore a long black winter coat, heavy enough to carry the season with it. Her skin held the pale tone of someone who had spent too many years indoors, but her eyes, clear blue and unwavering, studied Cole with calm curiosity rather than fear. She moved with careful economy, each motion deliberate, as if control had become a habit she refused to lose again. Near the counter sat a small canvas duffel bag, the kind issued to people leaving places that never expected them to come back. It held very little, just enough to begin again. Atlas walked past Cole and lay down near the doorway, as if he had already decided the threshold belonged to him now. The quiet steadiness of the dog softened the space before either human spoke. "I thought this place was empty," Cole said. "It was," Ruth replied, resting the broom against the counter. Her voice carried a low steadiness shaped by years of choosing words carefully. "For a long time." Cole nodded once. He recognized the faint tremor in her hands that never reached her voice. He had seen that separation before, strength in tone, effort in movement. People who had lost control once often moved like that afterward. "You fixing the roof?" he asked, nodding toward the ladder. "Trying to," she said. "Winter had its say." Cole studied the gap in the ceiling and the tools scattered nearby. Something about the scene felt familiar, the quiet persistence of someone repairing a place that offered no guarantee of reward. He had seen that same determination in soldiers repairing radios and engines in the middle of nowhere simply because broken things demanded attention. "You doing this alone?" Ruth shrugged lightly. "It's not heavy work, just slow work." Cole understood the difference immediately. Slow work was often the heaviest kind, stretched across days instead of minutes. He glanced toward Atlas, who remained stretched near the door, completely at ease. Cole exhaled. "I can patch the roof if you've got something resembling tools." Ruth studied him for a moment before nodding. "They're older than you," she said, "but they still believe in effort." The faintest smile touched the corner of Cole's mouth before disappearing again. They worked mostly in silence. Cole climbed the ladder and began patching the roof while Ruth handed up supplies with steady efficiency. The rhythm of the work surprised him. Measure, cut, hammer, repeat. For the first time since returning to Millbrook, his thoughts stopped circling the past long enough to focus on something that could actually be finished. Fixing a roof didn't rewrite history, but it quieted the noise long enough for breathing to feel simple again. Hours slipped past without announcement. Dust drifted in pale sunlight. The building slowly shifted from abandoned to paused. Atlas remained at the doorway the entire time, occasionally lifting his head when distant cars passed, then settling again as if guarding a space he had already chosen. By late afternoon, the leak was sealed. Cole climbed down and brushed dust from his hands, surprised by the absence of pressure in his chest. He hadn't noticed when the tightness left. Only that it had. "Thank you," Ruth said quietly. Cole nodded. "Didn't feel like going home yet." Ruth's expression softened, not with pity, but recognition. "This place is good at holding quiet," she said. "You can sit a minute if you want." Atlas stretched, sighing deeply, and rested his head on his paws by the door, as if the invitation applied to him as well. For the first time since returning to Millbrook, Cole did not feel the immediate urge to leave. The repaired roof changed the way the building sounded. Wind no longer whistled through the ceiling, and the quiet inside copper lantern felt less fragile, as if the walls had decided to trust gravity again. Cole had not planned to return the next morning, yet he found himself walking the same road with Atlas before the sun had fully climbed above the gray horizon. He told himself he needed to check the repair. He told himself work unfinished tended to echo. Atlas walked beside him with calm certainty, tail low and relaxed, already familiar with the direction. Ruth was outside when they arrived, kneeling beside a row of old planters near the building's entrance. The soil was stiff with cold, but she worked it patiently with a small hand shovel, turning the earth as if time itself might soften if given enough attention. She wore the same long black winter coat, sleeves rolled just enough to keep them from the dirt, breath rising in pale clouds each time she exhaled. She looked up when Atlas padded closer, and the corners of her mouth lifted slightly in recognition before her eyes reached Cole. "Roof still holding?" she asked. Cole glanced upward out of habit. It hasn't tried to leave yet. Good, she said, pushing herself upright with a small effort she pretended didn't exist. I'm learning not to celebrate small victories too early. Cole nodded, hands in his coat pockets, unsure why he had come back, and even less sure why leaving again felt harder than arriving. Atlas walked to the doorway and lay down without hesitation, as though he had clocked in for a shift no one had officially assigned. They spent the morning in companionable quiet. Cole repaired loose boards along the side wall, while Ruth sorted through boxes that had likely sat untouched for years. Dust turned the air soft and hazy, sunlight drifting through the windows in pale sheets. Every task felt small and ordinary, and yet the rhythm of shared work settled into something unexpectedly steady. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply, and Ruth disappeared into the back room without explanation. Cole continued tightening screws along the doorframe until the smell of something warm drifted into the main room. It reached Atlas first. The dog's ears lifted, head tilting toward the source with sudden interest before he stood and walked toward the hallway with slow curiosity. Ruth reappeared carrying a large pot wrapped in a towel, steam curling into the cold air around her hands. You've done enough for today, she said simply. You should eat. Cole opened his mouth to protest automatically, then closed it again. The smell of simmered vegetables and herbs reached him before words did. It felt unfamiliar in a place that had smelled like dust for decades. They ate in a small back room that must once have been an office. Ruth had cleared a narrow table and found mismatched plates from a cardboard box. The overhead light buzzed faintly, but the warmth of the food filled the space in a way electricity never could. Atlas settled beneath the table, head resting on his paws, body fully relaxed for the first time since Cole had returned to Millbrook. Cole held the fork for a moment before taking the first bite. The simple act felt strangely ceremonial, as though he had forgotten the rhythm of shared meals somewhere along the way. The food tasted warm and grounding, nothing extravagant, just stew thick with vegetables and bread, toasted until its edges crisped. It tasted like effort. Ruth watched him quietly for a moment before returning her attention to her plate. You look like someone who hasn't eaten at a table in a while, she said. Cole swallowed before answering. You get used to eating wherever you can. Ruth nodded, the kind of understanding that did not ask for details. Prisons teach the same lesson, she said matter-of-factly. The words landed softly but carried weight. Cole glanced at her, surprised by the lack of hesitation in her tone. She didn't say more, and he didn't ask. Silence settled again, comfortable and unforced. Atlas sighed deeply beneath the table, paws twitching slightly as sleep pulled him under. Cole noticed the way the dog's breathing slowed, steady and untroubled. It had been a long time since he had seen Atlas rest so completely in a new place. Ruth set her fork down and studied Cole with a quiet gentleness that felt older than either of them. You can stay for coffee, she said. Kid. The word caught him off guard. No one had called him that in decades. For a moment, he almost corrected her. Instead, he nodded once. The knock on the door came just as Ruth poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. It was firm and familiar, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who did not worry about whether they were welcome. Atlas lifted his head but did not rise, watching the door with calm interest. Ruth opened it to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with a thick gray mustache and a wool coat that had clearly survived more winters than most people willingly would. Hank Doyle carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had lived in the same town long enough to know which doors opened without asking. His hands were large and weathered, the kind that suggested decades of mechanical work, and his eyes held the warm steadiness of someone who preferred listening to speaking. Well, I'll be, Hank said, stepping inside and stamping snow from his boots. Didn't think I'd see this place breathing again. Ruth's expression softened. You always said it would, she replied. Hank noticed Cole then, offering a firm handshake that carried more reassurance than curiosity. Hank Doyle, he said, old friend of Ruth's father, been checking in on the place longer than I care to admit. Cole introduced himself, grip steady, but reserved. Hank nodded toward the ceiling. You the one who convinced the roof not to fall in? Temporary truce, Cole answered. Good enough, Hank said with a grin. He accepted a mug of coffee and settled into the chair as if it had always been his. Conversation flowed easily between him and Ruth, stories of the town slipping into the room like old songs remembered by heart. Cole listened more than he spoke, absorbing details about a place that had continued living while he had been elsewhere. At one point, Hank leaned back, glancing between them. "My grandson's back in town, too," he said casually. "Lawyer now, Noah. You might run into him sooner or later." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "Millbrook's getting crowded again," she said. Cole said nothing, but the idea settled quietly in his mind, like a distant echo. Evening crept in without ceremony. Hank left with promises to return, and the quiet returned to the building like a familiar guest. Ruth began clearing dishes while Cole stood near the doorway, uncertain why the thought of leaving felt heavier than it should. "You don't have to keep coming back just because you helped fix the roof," Ruth said without turning around. Cole hesitated before answering. "I know." She dried her hands slowly. "But you're welcome if you do." Atlas stood and stretched, tail swaying gently as he walked to Cole's side. The dog glanced toward the door, then back toward Ruth, as if weighing both options. Cole exhaled slowly. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said before he could reconsider. Ruth smiled without surprise. "Good, kid." For the second time since returning to Millbrook, Cole realized he had postponed calling the realtor. And for the first time, he did not immediately feel guilty about it. The first light inside Copper Lantern no longer came only from the windows. By the third morning, Cole returned. Extension cords snaked across the floor, and an old fuse box sat open against the wall like a patient waiting for surgery. The building still smelled faintly of dust and old oil, but the silence inside had changed. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt unfinished. Cole stood on a wooden step stool with a flashlight clamped between his teeth, studying a tangle of brittle wires that looked as though they had given up years ago. Electricity had always felt like controlled chaos to him, dangerous, precise, and oddly calming when understood. Atlas lay near the doorway watching him work, ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds outside, but otherwise relaxed in the steady rhythm of familiar labor. Ruth moved quietly between rooms, sorting through old boxes and wiping surfaces that had forgotten what sunlight felt like. She paused whenever Cole tested a circuit, standing still with hands folded together as though holding her breath, until the bulb either flickered or surrendered entirely. When the first overhead light finally glowed with a dull but stubborn life, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I forgot how loud light can be," she said softly. Cole stepped down and wiped his hands on a rag. "It'll get brighter." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the bulb, as if brightness itself required trust. By midday, the main room hummed faintly with electricity. Lamps flickered awake one by one, and the shadows inside the building retreated toward corners where dust still ruled. Cole found himself working slower than necessary, stretching tasks into hours without admitting to himself why. Every repaired outlet, every replaced switch, every small victory delayed the moment he would have to decide what came next. Atlas wandered more than usual that afternoon. Instead of remaining near the doorway, he paced the edges of the property, nose low, tail steady, attention drawn toward the open land behind the building. Beyond the cracked pavement stretched a patch of frozen grass bordered by trees and a collapsed wooden fence. Near the far edge of the lot sat a circular mound of earth half hidden beneath weeds and frost. The dog stopped there often, standing still, watching. Cole noticed the pattern by the third trip outside. Atlas would walk the perimeter, pause at the mound, stare for several seconds, then return to the door without explanation. It was not anxiety, it was curiosity, focused and patient. "What's out there?" Cole asked one afternoon, nodding toward the back lot. Ruth followed his gaze. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly before settling into something neutral. "Old, well," she said. "Been covered for years." Cole studied the uneven ground again. "Doesn't look that old," Ruth shrugged lightly. "Some things stop being useful before they stop existing." The answer felt complete and incomplete at the same time. Cole let it go, but Atlas did not. The dog returned to the mound twice more before sunset, standing motionless each time, as if listening to something buried beneath the frost. Late in the afternoon, the rumble of a truck approached, tires crunching across gravel, before coming to a stop outside the building. Atlas lifted his head, but did not rise, tail thumping once against the floor, as though recognizing the sound. Cole stepped outside just as the driver's door opened. Hank Doyle climbed down from the cab, adjusting his thick wool coat against the cold. Beside him stepped a younger man who moved with a careful confidence that suggested years of learning how to enter rooms where he did not yet belong. Noah Doyle looked to be in his early 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair kept neatly trimmed and a short beard that softened otherwise sharp features. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a navy sweater, the kind of clothing chosen for courtrooms rather than construction sites. His eyes carried the attentive alertness of someone trained to observe before speaking. "Noah," Hank said, clapping a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Told you the place was coming back to life." Noah studied the building for a moment before stepping forward. "I remember this place," he said quietly. His voice held a thoughtful calm that contrasted with Hank's easy warmth. "My mom used to stop here for gas when I was a kid." Ruth appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth. The moment her eyes met Noah's, a flicker of recognition passed between them, brief but unmistakable. "You were young," Ruth said gently. Noah nodded. "I remember the day they took you away." He spoke the words carefully, as if aware of how fragile they might feel, once spoken aloud. "My grandfather told me later what happened. I always wondered how you were doing." Ruth absorbed the statement without visible reaction, though her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth in her hand. "I'm doing," she said simply. Noah offered a small nod, understanding the boundary. He turned his attention to the repaired lights inside, then back to Cole. "You're the one fixing the place?" "Trying to," Cole answered. Noah extended a hand, grip firm but respectful. "Noah Doyle." Cole introduced himself, sensing the subtle difference in this meeting compared to the others. Where Hank brought warmth and familiarity, Noah brought observation and quiet attention, the kind of presence that noticed details others overlooked. They talked briefly about the building, about the town, about small things that filled space without demanding too much from anyone. Yet the conversation carried an undercurrent Cole couldn't quite name. Something in Noah's gaze lingered on Ruth when he thought she wasn't looking. Not suspicion, not pity, something closer to unfinished thought. Atlas wandered back toward the mound once more during their conversation, stopping at the edge of the frozen grass. He stood there longer this time, ears forward, posture alert but calm. Cole followed his gaze, noticing the uneven ground again. Noah noticed too. "What's back there?" he asked. "Oldwell," Ruth replied from the doorway. Noah nodded slowly, as if filing the information away rather than dismissing it. The movement was subtle, but Cole recognized it immediately, the quiet habit of someone who collected details for later. Dusk settled early, turning the sky a dull blue-gray. Hank and Noah prepared to leave, promising to return soon. As the truck disappeared down the road, the quiet returned with familiar weight. Ruth switched on the newly repaired lights, and the building glowed softly against the falling evening. Cole stood near the doorway, watching the brightness fill the room. Atlas returned from the back lot and lay down beside him, head resting on his paws, gaze still drifting occasionally toward the hidden well. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth said quietly, "Small towns remember everything, even the things they pretend to forget." Cole glanced toward the darkening road, the words settling somewhere deeper than he expected. Atlas lifted his head again, ears turning toward the distant trees, as if listening for something that had not yet decided to arrive. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, though none of them knew exactly what they would grow into. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. Not the gentle, quiet copper lantern had grown used to, but the kind of silence that feels disturbed, as if sound itself had backed away from the scene. Cole noticed it before he reached the building. Atlas noticed it sooner. The dog's pace slowed along the gravel road, ears angled forward, posture tightening in a way that carried none of the calm curiosity he had shown in recent days. This was alertness, purposeful and immediate. The front window had been shattered. Glass glittered across the frozen pavement like scattered ice, the jagged hole in the pane catching the pale morning light. The front door hung slightly ajar, its frame twisted where the lock had been forced. Atlas moved ahead of Cole without command, nose low, body tense but controlled. He paused at the threshold, listening, then stepped inside with the slow confidence of a partner clearing a room. The smell hit first. Cold air mixed with dust and something metallic, fear disguised as vandalism. Shelves had been overturned, boxes ripped open, tools scattered across the floor, as if someone had searched with impatience rather than purpose. A spray-painted message streaked across the far wall in uneven black letters. Leave. Cole stood motionless for a moment, the scene settling into his chest with a familiar heaviness. Chaos always carried a pattern if you looked long enough. This was not random destruction. Someone had wanted the message seen. Ruth appeared from the back hallway, breath clouding in the cold air. She stopped when she saw the room, the broom slipping from her hands with a hollow clatter. For a second, her composure faltered, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way her shoulders stiffened as though bracing for an impact that had already landed. I locked the door, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Cole moved carefully through the debris, eyes scanning the room out of instinct. Who knew you were back? Ruth shook her head slowly. Everyone. The answer carried no bitterness, only certainty. Atlas paced the perimeter, pausing near the back hallway before returning to Cole's side. His ears remained forward, gaze alert, body ready. The dog's unease filled the space left by silence. Cole stepped outside and pulled his phone from his pocket. He hesitated before dialing. Asking for help had never come easily, but neither had pretending damage would repair itself. Noah arrived within the hour. He stepped out of his car, dressed for the cold, charcoal coat pulled tight against the wind. Expression focused in a way that felt older than his years. His eyes moved across the broken window, the open door, the scattered debris, absorbing details without comment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm steadiness, sharpened by concern. I thought this might happen, he said. Ruth folded her arms across her chest. You expected this? Noah nodded once. Small towns don't forget scandals. They just bury them until someone digs too close again. Cole watched him carefully. You think this is about the case? I think someone believes it is, Noah replied. They walked through the building together, Noah pausing to study the spray-painted message before stepping closer to the wall. His gaze lingered not on the words, but on the uneven edges of the paint, the hurried strokes, the lack of disguise. This wasn't meant to be anonymous, he said. It was meant to be seen quickly. Ruth leaned against the counter, silent. Noah turned toward her gently. If you want, I can request access to the old case files. It won't be fast, but it's possible. Ruth hesitated before answering. I served my time. That doesn't mean the truth served anything, Noah said quietly. The words settled heavily in the room. Outside, the wind pushed across the empty lot, rattling the loose sign near the road. Atlas stood near the doorway, gaze drifting toward the back field again, toward the place where the earth rose unevenly above the buried well. His posture stiffened, tail low, attention fixed as though the disturbance inside the building had stirred something beyond it. Cole followed the dog's gaze and felt a slow realization forming in his chest. This was no longer about a building or a roof or a few days of helping a stranger. The silence of the town felt different now, intentional, watchful. He turned back toward Noah. How long would it take to get those files? Noah met his eyes, understanding the shift in the question. Long enough to make someone uncomfortable. Cole nodded slowly. For the first time since returning to Millbrook, the idea of leaving felt less like escape and more like surrender. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Atlas moved to stand beside him, steady and certain. The town had spoken without showing its face, and Cole had decided to answer. The storm arrived before sunset, rolling over Millbrook in thick gray layers that swallowed the horizon and pressed the sky low against the rooftops. By the time the first drop struck the windows of Copper Lantern, the air already carried the heavy promise of a long night. Cole had been working near the fuse box when thunder rumbled across the hills, the sound deep enough to vibrate through the walls. Atlas lifted his head instantly, ears angled toward the sky, body alert but steady. Storms did not frighten him. Sudden noise did not confuse him. He simply prepared. Ruth stood near the doorway watching the dark clouds gather. She did not move away from the window when lightning flashed, though her shoulders tightened slightly each time the sky split open. "It gets loud out here," she said quietly, as if the weather were an old acquaintance she did not entirely trust. "The roof still leaks in places I haven't found yet." Cole followed her gaze toward the empty road disappearing into rain. The idea of returning to the silent house suddenly felt heavier than the storm outside. When Ruth spoke again, her voice carried the same calm tone she used when discussing broken pipes or empty shelves, but the request beneath it felt far more personal. "Would you mind staying tonight?" Cole did not answer immediately. Atlas stepped closer and leaned gently against his leg, the familiar grounding pressure arriving before panic had the chance to. Cole nodded once. "Yeah, I can stay." Night fell quickly, thick clouds swallowing what little light the day had left behind. The repaired wiring carried electricity through the building in a quiet hum, but the storm pushed darkness against every window. Rain battered the roof in steady waves, the sound relentless enough to blur the edges of silence. Ruth prepared a small pot of tea and left a lantern burning on the counter, its warm glow softening the edges of the room when lightning flashed. The building felt smaller in the storm, the world beyond the windows reduced to wind and water. Atlas settled near the doorway, head resting on his paws, watching the room with the steady patience of a sentinel who understood the long hours of night. Cole lay on the old couch in the office room, boots still on, jacket folded beneath his head. He had learned long ago that storms carried memories the way rivers carried debris, unpredictable and impossible to stop once they started moving. He closed his eyes anyway. Sleep did not arrive gently. It arrived like impact. A flash of lightning tore across the sky. At the same moment, thunder struck overhead, the sound exploding through the building like a detonation. Cole woke instantly, breath caught halfway between inhale and alarm. The room felt wrong, too dark, too loud. The storm pressed against the walls like distant artillery. The lantern flickered. Cole sat upright too quickly. The room tilted slightly as adrenaline flooded his chest before reason could follow. His hand reached blindly for stability and found the edge of the counter. The lantern tipped. Glass struck wood. Oil spilled. Flame leapt. For one suspended second, the fire glowed brighter than the lightning. Then Atlas was there. The dog pressed firmly against Cole's leg, shoulder braced with calm certainty, grounding him in the present before panic could complete its climb. Cole's breath came in sharp bursts, hands trembling as he smothered the small flame with a heavy cloth. Smoke curled into the air, thin and bitter, but the fire died quickly. The silence that followed felt louder than the storm. Cole remained crouched on the floor, breathing hard, hands still shaking. Atlas stayed beside him, unmoving, the quiet weight of the dog anchoring him to the room, to the moment, to the fact that the war existed only in memory now. A faint mechanical click sounded from the back room. Cole froze. Atlas lifted his head. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere deeper in the building, electricity moved through wires that had not carried power in years. A low hum filled the hallway, unfamiliar and out of place. Atlas stood and walked toward the sound without hesitation. Cole followed slowly, heart still racing but steadier now. The hum grew louder as they moved down the narrow hallway toward a small storage room Ruth had not yet fully cleared. Dust coated the shelves, and stacks of old boxes lined the walls. In the center of the room sat a small desk against the far wall, half hidden beneath a cloth. Atlas stopped beside it and looked back. Cole pulled the cloth away. Beneath it rested an old landline answering machine, its plastic casing yellowed with age. A small red light blinked steadily, the motion quiet but unmistakable. The machine hummed faintly, alive again after years of silence. A recorded voice crackled through the speaker. Ruth appeared in the doorway just as the sound filled the room. "Ruthie, if you're hearing this, it means the power finally came back." The voice was older, gentle but firm, carrying the steady cadence of someone who believed in preparation. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth, breath catching in a quiet gasp. Tears filled her eyes before she spoke a single word. My mother, she whispered. The recording continued, static crackling softly beneath each sentence. I know you won't look for trouble, so I'm leaving this where you won't think to search. The letters are inside the tall cabinet in the office, the one with the false back. Your father didn't trust the Grayson family, and neither should you. The message ended in a soft click. Silence returned, thick and stunned. Ruth stood motionless, eyes fixed on the machine, as if afraid it might disappear if she blinked. Cole felt the shift in the room, the same way he had felt the storm arriving hours earlier. Something had changed. The past had spoken, and the present had no choice but to listen. Atlas sat quietly between them, gaze steady, as though he had known the voice would come long before anyone else did. Cole exhaled slowly. He had come to Millbrook, planning to leave. He had stayed to fix a roof. Now the past had asked him to help uncover something buried far deeper than broken wood and faulty wiring. He met Ruth's eyes and knew the answer before the question formed. He was not leaving. Morning arrived slowly after the storm, the kind of pale winter dawn that made everything look washed clean, but not entirely forgiven. The copper lantern felt different in the quiet light. The storm had rattled the building, shaken old dust loose, and left the air sharp with the faint scent of wet wood and metal. Cole had not slept again after the recording, neither had Ruth. Some discoveries refused to wait politely for rest. The answering machine sat on the desk where they had left it, silent now, its small red light dark after delivering a message meant for another lifetime. Ruth stood beside the doorway with her arms folded, the long black coat wrapped tightly around her, as if warmth alone could steady her thoughts. Her eyes looked older than they had the day before, not with weakness, but with the heavy clarity that came when the past suddenly stepped into the room uninvited. The tall cabinet, she said quietly. In the office. Cole nodded once. Atlas stood already, tail low but steady, ears forward in quiet anticipation. The dog had sensed the shift in the air long before words confirmed it. He moved ahead down the hallway with calm certainty, nails tapping softly across the wooden floor. The office room felt smaller in daylight. The narrow table where they had shared meals sat pushed against the wall, and beside it stood the tall wooden cabinet Ruth's mother had mentioned. It was an unremarkable piece of furniture at first glance. Dark oak, narrow doors, brass handles dulled with age. The kind of cabinet that disappeared into a room until someone needed to remember it existed. Cole ran a hand along the wood, feeling the subtle imperfections beneath the varnish. Atlas paced once in front of it, nose low, then sat abruptly near the right side panel, his paw lifted and pressed once against the wood, then again, more insistently. Cole crouched, following the dog's focus. The panel looked no different from the rest, but Atlas remained fixed on the same spot, gaze steady and expectant. You found something? Cole murmured. Ruth stepped closer, breath held without realizing it. Cole tapped the wood lightly. The sound changed halfway along the panel, solid shifting suddenly to hollow. He glanced at Ruth. She nodded once, the movement small but resolute. The panel came free with gentle pressure. Behind it lay a narrow, hidden compartment, long and shallow, sealed away for decades. Dust rested untouched along the edges as though time itself had respected the secrecy. Inside sat a bundle of letters tied with fading twine, several folded maps yellowed with age, and a small cloth pouch heavy enough to sag against the wood. Ruth's hands trembled as she reached for the letters. The paper crackled softly when she unfolded the first page. The handwriting was firm and deliberate, each stroke careful, as though the writer had known these words would need to survive years of silence. "My father," she whispered. Cole unfolded one of the maps, spreading it carefully across the desk. It revealed a detailed geological survey of the land surrounding Copper Lantern, lines and symbols marking layers beneath the soil. A series of red circles traced a path from the building to the old well behind it. He opened the pouch last. Raw gold glinted in the morning light. Uneven nuggets, dull and heavy, unmistakable even without polish. The room fell silent as the realization settled between them. "They found it," Cole said quietly. Ruth nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the letters. The Grayson family. The name hung in the air like a storm cloud that had not yet decided where to break. The letters told the rest. Ruth's father had discovered the gold vein years before the town ever suspected it existed. The Graysons had offered to buy the land quietly, insisting it would be good for the town. When he refused, the accusations began. Money disappeared, accounts shifted, evidence appeared where none had existed before. Ruth closed her eyes, the truth settling heavily into the spaces left by years of unanswered questions. They needed the land, she said, and I was the easiest obstacle to remove. Atlas sat quietly beside her, pressing gently against her leg, as if sensing the tremor beneath her calm. Cole studied the maps again, the red circles leading inevitably toward the covered well behind the building. The pieces fit too cleanly to ignore. This was not coincidence, it was design. He folded the map carefully. Noah needs to see this. Ruth nodded without hesitation. By afternoon, Noah stood in the same office, sleeves rolled back, the careful composure he carried, slipping just enough to reveal genuine shock. He read the letters slowly, then again more carefully, the habit of a lawyer unwilling to trust first impressions. This changes everything, he said at last. If these documents are authentic, the case was built on fabricated evidence. Ruth leaned against the desk, silent. Noah met Cole's eyes. This won't be easy. The Grayson name still carries weight here. Cole nodded. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt the clarity of purpose settle into his chest. Not survival, not escape, direction. Easy wasn't part of the plan, he said. Atlas stepped closer, tail brushing against his leg in quiet agreement. The storm had uncovered more than broken wiring and hidden recordings. It had unearthed a reason to stay. For the first time since the war ended, Cole Bennett had something he wanted to fight for. The discovery in the cabinet did not explode into action the way Cole had expected. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like frost spreading across glass. Noah spent the next several days inside the small office at Copper Lantern, turning the narrow desk into a temporary command center of folders, legal pads, and neatly stacked documents. He worked with the quiet intensity of someone who understood the weight of patience. The law did not move quickly. It moved carefully, especially when the truth threatened to embarrass the powerful. Cole fixed small things around the building, while Noah read loose boards, a stubborn door hinge, a flickering exterior light that refused to commit to staying on. Each task gave his hands something to do, while his mind circled the same growing realization. This fight would not look like the ones he understood. There would be no clear battlefield, no obvious enemy, only paperwork and silence. Atlas spent more time near Noah than before, often lying beside the desk as if guarding the steady rhythm of turning pages. The dog's calm presence seemed to anchor the room, grounding the tension that built with each new discovery. One afternoon, Noah finally leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked older in that moment, the careful composure replaced by quiet disbelief. It wasn't just the Grayson family, he said. Ruth paused mid-step, a stack of clean dishes in her hands. What do you mean? Noah exhaled slowly, choosing his words with precision. Your case file is full of gaps, missing statements, financial records that were never submitted, witnesses who changed testimony without explanation. He hesitated before continuing. And every signature approving those decisions came from town officials. The room fell still. Cole watched Ruth carefully, expecting anger, outrage, or even relief. Instead, she lowered the dishes onto the counter and sat down slowly, hands resting in her lap. They were afraid, she said quietly. Noah frowned. Afraid enough to send you to prison? Ruth nodded. Afraid enough to keep the town alive. The explanation settled heavily in the room. Copper Lantern sat at the edge of a town that had survived on routine and predictability for generations. The Grayson family owned half the businesses along Main Street, their names stamped quietly across supply contracts, construction permits, and employment records. If their wealth came from land beneath the gas station, then the town itself had grown from that soil. Cole felt the realization land slowly. the way a distant storm announces itself long before the rain begins. They protected the town, he said, not the truth. Noah nodded once. It's easier to ignore injustice when it pays your mortgage. Ruth folded her hands together, gaze steady. I don't hate them. The statement surprised both men. I hate what happened, she continued, but I understand fear. Fear makes people quiet. Quiet turns into agreement faster than anyone notices. Atlas shifted beside her chair, pressing gently against her leg as though the quiet weight of the dog could carry some of the sadness words could not. Noah closed the file in front of him. This isn't just a legal case, he said. This is a town choosing whether it wants to remember. The days that followed confirmed it. Noah visited the courthouse, the county records office, and the small brick building that served as Millbrook's town hall. Each place greeted him with polite smiles and careful conversations that revealed nothing directly, while saying far too much between the lines. On one visit, he met Mayor Walter Grayson for the first time. Walter Grayson was a tall man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair and the kind of posture shaped by decades of public appearances. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, his voice smooth enough to carry reassurance even when delivering unwelcome news. He spoke with the measured warmth of someone who had spent years mastering the art of sounding reasonable. We all want what's best for Millbrook, the mayor said during their meeting, fingers steepled neatly on his desk. Digging into old wounds rarely helps anyone heal. Noah listened without interrupting, the calm focus of a lawyer absorbing every word for later examination. He left the office with polite thanks and a growing certainty that the resistance he felt had deeper roots than paperwork alone. When he returned to Copper Lantern that evening, the weight of the conversation followed him inside like cold air through an open door. They know, he told Ruth and Cole. They've always known. Ruth nodded slowly. Of course they do. Cole leaned against the counter, arms folded. So the whole town stayed quiet. Noah hesitated before answering. Not the whole town. Just the people who believed silence was safer than change. The distinction mattered more than the words suggested. That night, the lights of Copper Lantern glowed softly against the winter dark. Cars passed occasionally on the distant road, their headlights flickering briefly across the windows before disappearing again. The building felt less like an abandoned gas station now, and more like a place waiting to decide what it wanted to become. Cole stood near the doorway watching the road, Atlas beside him, tail brushing softly against his leg. This isn't just about Ruth anymore, he said quietly. Noah nodded. No, it's about what kind of town Millbrook wants to be. Ruth watched them both, her expression calm but thoughtful. Then, let's give them the chance to choose. Outside, the night remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the pause before something changed. The notice appeared on the chain-link fence sometime before sunrise. Cole saw it the moment he stepped out of the truck. The paper stapled crookedly to the metal, as if whoever had put it there wanted it seen quickly rather than neatly. Atlas slowed beside him, posture tightening as the dog's gaze moved from the fence to the empty lot beyond it. The paper fluttered slightly in the winter wind. Property sealed, risk of ground collapse, county order. Cole read it twice before turning toward the building. Ruth stood in the doorway already, long black coat pulled tight around her, eyes fixed on the sign with quiet understanding rather than surprise. Noah arrived minutes later, breath visible in the cold as he jogged across the gravel lot, legal folder tucked beneath his arm. They filed it late last night, he said without greeting. Emergency safety order, no inspection request, no geological report, just a signature and a stamp. Cole glanced toward the back field where the uneven mound of earth hid the sealed well. Convenient timing. Noah nodded once. They're running out of ways to slow us down. Ruth stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. They think time will erase it again. Atlas stood at the fence, ears forward, gaze locked on the distant well, as though the paper barrier meant nothing to him. Cole watched the dog for a long moment, the same realization forming that had followed him since the storm. Every step forward uncovered another attempt to push the truth deeper underground. That afternoon, Noah made calls from the small office desk, voice calm but firm as he navigated legal language and delayed responses. By evening, the answer arrived. The order would remain in place until the county approved an inspection. Days, possibly weeks. Cole stared out the window as dusk crept across the frozen lot. Weeks felt like surrender disguised as patience. "They're buying time," he said quietly. Noah didn't disagree. Night settled heavily over Millbrook, the sky clouded and moonless. The copper lantern glowed softly behind them as they stood outside, the sealed fence casting thin shadows across the ground. Atlas paced near the edge of the property, restless in a way Cole had not seen since the vandalism. The dog's nose lifted toward the wind, then lowered again to the frozen grass. Something had changed. Atlas moved suddenly, trotting along the fence line toward the far corner, where the metal dipped slightly into the earth. Cole followed without thinking, the crunch of frost beneath his boots loud in the still night. The dog stopped near a patch of disturbed soil just beyond the barrier. Fresh footprints cut across the ground. Not old, not weathered, recent. Cole crouched, brushing snow aside with gloved hands. The dirt beneath was dark and soft where the frost had been broken. A shallow trench led toward the covered well, the earth uneven where someone had dug hurriedly and stopped just as quickly. "They came back," he said. Ruth and Noah joined him, their silence louder than words. Noah exhaled sharply. "If they're digging at night, they're trying to remove whatever's left before the inspection." Atlas stood at the edge of the disturbed ground, staring toward the well with focused intensity. The dog let out a low, single bark, rare and deliberate. Cole pulled out his phone. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Deputy Mark Ellison stepped out of the patrol car first, tall and broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a face shaped by years of quiet observation. His expression held none of the easy smiles common in small-town officers. Instead, he studied the scene with careful neutrality, the posture of a man who preferred evidence to assumptions. He had grown up in Millbrook, though he had left briefly to serve in the state patrol before returning years later to care for an aging parent. The town knew him as reliable, steady, and difficult to pressure. "What have we got?" he asked, voice low and even. Cole gestured toward the disturbed soil and the sealed well beyond it. Ellison crouched beside the trench, brushing gloved fingers across the loose dirt. His jaw tightened slightly. "This wasn't animals," he said. "Too clean, too recent." The fence was opened under official supervision, the temporary seal reduced to paper and plastic in the face of active tampering. Floodlights illuminated the back lot, turning the frozen ground stark and pale. The mound covering the well was cleared carefully, layer by layer, until the old stone ring emerged from beneath years of neglect. A metal lid sealed the opening, rusted but intact. Ellison and his partner lifted it slowly. Cold air rose from the darkness below, carrying the damp scent of stone and old water. A rope and harness were lowered carefully into the well, the beam of a flashlight cutting through darkness as Ellison descended step by measured step. The silence above stretched long enough to feel endless. Then his voice echoed upward. "I found something?" The crate emerged dripping with cold water, its thick plastic shell sealed tight against time. Mud streaked its sides, the latch secured with heavy tape that had begun to peel at the edges. Cole felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest before the lid even opened. Inside lay stacks of waterproof folders, their edges warped but intact. Financial records, contracts, signed statements. Years of silence given shape. Noah knelt beside the crate, hands trembling slightly as he opened the first folder. His breath caught halfway between relief and disbelief. "This is it," he said. "Payments, false affidavits, witness statements rewritten and signed." Ruth stood a few steps back, hands clasped together, eyes shining, not with triumph, but with quiet release. Cole watched Atlas instead. The dog sat beside him, tail resting still against the ground, gaze steady, as though the tension that had drawn him to the well for days had finally eased. If they had waited even a few hours longer, the crate might have disappeared into another chapter of silence. Instead, the truth rose from the dark and into the light. The truth did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, like dawn slipping across the town without asking permission. Court filings moved faster than anyone expected once the documents from the well reached the right hands. Signatures appeared where silence had once lived, statements were rewritten, apologies were issued carefully, publicly, and far too late to erase the years that had passed. By the time the final ruling came, Millbrook felt as though it had been holding its breath for a decade and only just remembered how to exhale. Ruth Callahan stood on the courthouse steps beneath a pale winter sky, while reporters from neighboring towns asked questions. She answered simply and without bitterness. She wore the same long black coat she had worn the day Cole first met her, the fabric pressed and neat, the silver in her hair catching the morning light. She did not look triumphant. She looked steady. The judge's ruling had cleared her name completely. Wrongful conviction, fabricated evidence, official apology issued by the county and the town council. The words felt enormous, yet Ruth received them with quiet composure, as though vindication was simply another task to complete before moving forward. Noah stood a few steps behind her, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the scene with the quiet pride of someone who had spent weeks fighting a battle fought mostly in silence. Hank Doyle lingered near the edge of the crowd, nodding to familiar faces as townspeople gathered with cautious curiosity. Cole stayed slightly apart from the cameras, Atlas seated beside him with the calm patience that had become second nature. The dog's presence grounded the moment, reminding him that not every victory needed noise. When the reporters finally drifted away, the town remained. Neighbors who had once crossed the street rather than meet Ruth's eyes now stood in small clusters along the sidewalk. Their expressions carried a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and the quiet discomfort of people confronting their own silence. No one spoke at first. Then an older woman stepped forward, hands clasped together tightly, voice trembling with sincerity as she apologized. The moment opened a door. Others followed, one by one, words offered awkwardly but honestly. Ruth listened to every apology with the same gentle nod, accepting them not because they erased the past, but because they signaled the possibility of a different future. A week later, the question of the gold arrived. It came not as a demand, but as a proposal delivered through lawyers and town meetings, wrapped in language about economic growth and shared opportunity. The land beneath Copper Lantern could make Millbrook prosperous for generations. Investors were ready, plans were drafted, promises were made. Ruth listened to each presentation without interruption. When the final meeting ended, the room fell silent as she rose to speak. Her voice carried no anger, no hesitation, only the quiet strength of someone who had learned the cost of division. "This town already paid too high a price for what's under that ground," she said. "We don't need to repeat the mistake." The decision stunned the room into stillness. She refused to sell, refused to mine, refused to allow the land to become another reason neighbors looked at one another with suspicion instead of trust. Word spread faster than any official announcement. The choice did not bring cheers. It brought reflection, the kind that settled slowly and refused to leave. The following Saturday morning, Cole arrived at Copper Lantern expecting another quiet day of repairs. Instead, he found a pickup truck parked beside the building, then another, and another. By the time he stepped out of his truck, half the town seemed to be gathering in the cold winter air, tools in hand and uncertainty in their eyes. No one had asked them to come. They came anyway. Hank Doyle organized ladders near the roof, while Noah carried boxes of donated supplies from the back of his car. Deputy Ellison directed traffic along the roadside to keep the narrow lane clear. Neighbors who had once passed the building without looking now painted walls, repaired shelves, and replaced broken glass with careful hands. Someone brought coffee. Someone else brought fresh wood for shelving. Laughter returned slowly, cautiously, like a sound rediscovering its place. Atlas moved through the crowd with calm acceptance, greeting strangers with quiet curiosity, before settling near the doorway, as if overseeing the transformation. Cole worked alongside them, without needing instructions, hands moving automatically, chest lighter than it had been in years. By evening, the Copper Lantern no longer resembled the abandoned building Cole had first approached weeks earlier. Warm light spilled from the windows. Fresh paint brightened the walls. The old sign near the road had been repaired and rehung, its faded lantern symbol restored carefully by a retired art teacher who insisted the details mattered. As dust settled, the final task remained. The new sign above the entrance flickered once, then twice, before glowing steadily against the darkening sky. The words Copper Lantern Fuel and Market shone warmly for the first time in years. The crowd fell silent. Ruth stood beside Cole at the edge of the lot, hands tucked into her coat pockets as she watched the light spread across the pavement. The glow reflected in her eyes, soft and steady. "I didn't give birth to you," she said quietly, voice barely louder than the evening wind. "But I'm very glad you stayed." Cole looked at the building, the town, the dog sitting calmly at his side. The house he had planned to sell remained standing at the end of a quiet road. The future he had never planned had unfolded one small decision at a time. For the first time since the war ended, Cole Bennett understood the difference between returning and arriving. He was home. The story of Cole, Ruth, and Atlas was never really about a gas station, a court case, or even the gold hidden beneath the ground. It was about what happens when broken people choose not to walk away from one another. A man who came to leave found a reason to stay. A woman who lost 10 years found a community willing to begin again. And a loyal dog reminded them both that healing often begins with simply standing beside someone who is hurting. In everyday life, miracles rarely arrive as lightning from the sky. Sometimes they look like neighbors bringing tools on a cold morning. Sometimes they sound like an apology spoken years too late. And sometimes they feel like a quiet moment when you realize you are no longer alone. Perhaps that is how God works most often, not through grand spectacle, but through ordinary people choosing kindness when it would be easier to stay silent. If this story moved your heart, let it travel further. Share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story touched you most. Your voice helps build the same kind of community this story celebrates.